So I am here now at the actual fort of Fort Ontario here in Oswego, New York. And the thing that I want to mention though is that the fort that we see today is not actually from the 18th century. Instead, it is a Victorian reconstruction built around, I believe, 1839 roughly. So the fort that we see today is more of a reconstruction of a 19th century fort, but in general, the position of the fort and general structure of the fort is very similar to what would have been seen in 1760. In 1756, the fort was more triangular in shape, or had a square in the center and then little triangles sticking out of each side. So it was a little bit different than what we see today, but again, the position is relatively the same, and the overall structure would have looked relatively similar. It wouldn't have been made of stone in 1756. I believe it was made of wood. But again, the position and the idea would have been similar. And the good thing about this fort is that it is a national, or part rather, of a National Historic Site. And it's relatively inexpensive to get into. It's only $4 per person, and it is extremely pet friendly, which is good. Pets are able to obviously go inside the fort, but as you can see, there are smaller buildings within the fort for the general garrison to live in and the commanders to live in, and pets are, especially dogs, are allowed within all of the buildings and even down in these casements down here. Alright, so I'm gonna walk in. And then here is just a little overview of the fort itself. Seeing here that it was rebuilt by the U.S. in 1839 to 1842, but the original fort was built here in 1755 and attacked in 1756 by the French. It really gives you a good idea on what it would have been like for an army to come up to these walls and try to attack it and siege it and capture it. Now, the one thing that I do want to mention about the 1756 fort is that this entrance was not here. Instead, this was just a wall. Instead, the entrance was on the other side, and I'll show you that when I get inside and I'm up top on the ramparts. Alright, so I am here on top of the ramparts of Fort Ontario. I'm going to get up on this top part here, but instead of being, so to say, dangerous about it, I'm going to find a shallower area right over here where I can climb up more easily, and then show you sort of some more highlights of the French attack in 1756. Before I go to that point right over there to kind of discuss what I was going to, I just want to give you all a good vantage point of up top here on the ramparts. Baseball fields over there. Obviously, those were not built in the 18th century. They are more, I would say, 20th century. Different park amenities over there. Parking lot. And the lake. Very good view of the lake and the Oswego Lighthouse right over there. And then, of course, the interior of the fort. Each of these buildings has its own purpose. That big brick building, move over here, that big brick building right over there is the entrance. This building was, I believe, a mess hall for the soldiers. That building now is an administration building and gift shop, but it was the post or the garrison watch building, I believe. And then these two, this one here and this one, were officers' quarters. And they're very nice inside. And the funny thing that I like to point out about these two buildings, especially this one here, is that the servants who were stationed on the top floor ironically had the best view of the lake, whereas the officers who lived on that second floor there had basically the view of either the ramparts or the interior of the fort. So funny thing is that the servants actually had the better view versus the soldiers or the officers who you would think, given the idea of the time period in this point, 19th century, generally the officers and the more, I guess you could say, wealthier people had the better stuff. But in this case, the servants had the best view in the house. And then over there is the city of Oswego with a plant, and then Century Oswego just beyond that factory area. Alright, so right now I'm going to stop here, and this vantage point is relatively good because it gives you an idea of what the British saw on August 13th, 1756. On that date, the French, well, let me back up a little bit. After the French landed on August 10th, 1756, and camped at St. Paul's Cemetery, the next day, August 11th and 12th, they marched about 1.5 miles from that spot to Fort Ontario, and then set up their lines, or their parallels, or siege equipment and battle line. I tried to map out more or less exactly where the French lines would have been. Like I said, this fort that we see is a 19th century reconstruction of what the fort looked like in the 18th century. So here are the images that I have, and this fort at the top is what it would have looked like in 1756. Then in 1760, the British recaptured it and built it into sort of what we see today. And then, of course, on the bottom, we have the 19th century reconstruction. So, judging from what the 18th century fort looked like compared to today, I estimated that from about this point here, I'll walk over there now, the French army was about 524 feet from the fort, or in this case, the ramparts. Now, that's a very specific number, but that number came from a secondary source. I didn't necessarily verify it, but it's the only number that I have, so I'm going to go with it for now, and even if it's off a little bit, it's not the end of the world, because it seems to make sense, and I'll explain why. Alright. Okay, so I'm here on top of the rampart, and over there we have a small little parking lot. There, you can just barely make it out, is the post cemetery that was established in the early 19th century, I believe, right after the War of 1812. A little walking area, baseball and softball fields, a little playground somewhere over in that area, and then, of course, the main parking lot and the rest of the city. So, why is this spot important? Well, like I mentioned, I estimated that it was from this spot that the French army was about 524 feet from the fort when they attacked on August 13th, 1756. On Google Maps, or rather, I'm sorry, Google Earth, I mapped it out, and 524 feet is roughly cutting through the center of the baseball fields. Baseball and softball fields, rather. Alright, so the French army would have extended from this parking lot over here all the way through that tree line, cutting down roughly the center of the baseball and softball fields, and then extending all the way down to roughly about those large buildings over there, right before the park entrance. Alright. The French battery would have been established right here in the baseball and softball fields, and they would have been relatively close. Now, I'm not super knowledgeable about 18th century warfare, other than naval warfare, but this to me seems like a very close area to be for a battery. However, it is, I would say, probably the best position because it is on a hill. Because once you get past the baseball and softball fields, you start to go down a little slope, and I'll show you that later. So really, if the battery is established around where the baseball and softball fields were, or rather are, they would have been on a plateau and had a clear sight of view to attack and blast away at the fort. Alright, so that gives you an idea of what the French lines would have, where the French lines would have been. Not necessarily what they would have looked like, but where they would have been in 1756. And again, it would be stretching from about the coast area through the parking lot or just before it, beyond a little in the center of that tree line, and then cutting through the baseball and softball fields and touching to about those buildings over there by the park entrance. Right about there. Alright. The other thing that I want to mention is while they were not here in 1756 when the French attacked, the British did eventually recapture the fort in 1759, I believe. And in 1760, or thereabouts, or just before, there were 2 redoubts established, or these small little fortifications, usually made of timber, very small, probably about 100 feet on each side. They were square, and they were just there for sort of like an extra layer of protection against an attack. For the first redoubt, I estimated, again using Google Earth and sources that I have, which I'll show you later, was right about roughly where the post cemetery is today. In 1760, when the British built the redoubt over by the post cemetery, they built a second one, and the second one was around this area here, and was roughly where this building right down there is, I believe. Yeah. Here's the lighthouse, lightkeeper's house, and then down there is a public works building. I can't quite remember what exactly it is, but right about there, maybe on this hill here by the small little parking lot, was just about where the second redoubt in 1760 was. I would imagine that it might not have, now looking at the topography, it might not have been actually where that building is, because that's in a valley, and usually redoubts and fortifications were built on top of hills. So my guess is that it was more on this rise here, near where the small parking lot and that tree shaded area is, versus down there. Or if they built it to specifically protect the transportation going down, up and down the river, then I would have expected, yes, they would probably build it around where that building is, maybe a little bit closer to the coast, because it would have given them a better chance at being able to protect the transportation and any French or any possible invasion that attempted to go down the Oswego River. The reason I wanted to come over here was to show you the area, roughly, where two other forts were in 1756. The first fort, and probably the oldest fort, was Fort Oswego, which was on that hill where you have all those trees. Roughly about there. So right on that hill, there's a park called Montcalm Park, and it's of course named after the French general who captured Oswego in 1756. There is a marker, or a plaque there, that tells you on that spot or thereabouts there was a fort named Fort Oswego, and I believe that fort was built in 1722. At first it was more or less a hunter's trading post, or protection for the hunting fur trade that was going on in the area in the early 18th century. And then eventually when Fort Ontario was built in 1755, the British rebuilt, or more or less added to, Fort Oswego to give it more protection. Along with that, they also built a third fort right about where this large water tower is, right over here on the side of the river, on that side of the river. That was called Fort George, and the British called it Fort Rascal or Fort Pepperell. It has a couple different names, but Fort George is the one that I know it as. Right down here, I'm not going to get too close, but down here on this grassy field area is where the French would have established their battery, or their cannon, against Fort George, or Fort Rascal, Fort Pepperell. Alright. After the British eventually abandoned Fort Ontario when they saw the French and noticed that they weren't able to really defend against them, they abandoned the fort, sailed across the river, and established themselves back around Fort George and Fort Oswego. The French then promptly took over the fort and then established a battery, again cannon, roughly about where this tree line is. Alright, it would have followed the structure of the fort, so it would have jutted out there, went back in, and then along this wall here, and then it extended out about where this tree line and this coastline is before the cliff. And like I said before, the original entrance to the fort was right over here. So here you see those casements right in that valley there would have been the entrance. Now it is just a wall, and the actual entrance is over here, but that would have been where the French were trying to enter the fort in 1756, as that was the original entrance in the 18th century.